Hello and welcome to Supply Chain Africa News. My name is Wanda Bwanyama.
The African Continental Free Trade Area commenced trading on the 1st of January 2021. To help us understand this monumental achievement, we are joined today by David Owiro, founder and principal consultant at the Africa Development Think Tank, a Nairobi-based international trade policy research organization. We will discuss what this means for the supply chain and logistics world and understand its broader economic implications on small and medium enterprises operating on the continent. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Wandabwa. My name is David Owiro. I am a trade policy expert. I have a consulting firm for which I do lots of trade policy work on the African continent.
Okay. So to most people, they might not understand all about this agreement. In a nutshell, can you kindly break it down for us?
Yes. So in the most basic explanation would be, as you know, countries trade, and the way countries trade, they use legal instruments to trade. These legal instruments allow the firms based in those countries to derive opportunities that exist in the global trade. And so for Africa in particular, there has been a push to have increased trade between countries. And this push is basically to drive down the trade barriers that exist between countries, but also just to be able to have a framework that allows for enhanced trading between African countries. And so the African Free Trade Continental Area is essentially a trading agreement that African nations have agreed to with a view to reduce their trade barriers, which includes both tariffs. As you know, when you import something or when you export, you face tariffs that you have to pay, essentially taxes. So to reduce those tariffs, as well as to reduce non-tariff barriers. And these include, hiccups that are often there at border points that business people face. So the idea is that, if we are able to trade more with each other within Africa, then we can have a launchpad for economic development goals that, every other nation has.
So when you're talking about this agreement, how will the SMEs benefit from this agreement?
Yeah, fantastic question. SMEs, are mostly where most trade happens. The businesses that are present at national level in Africa are not global businesses. Yes, there are global businesses available, but the majority of them are, small and micro and medium. And so if you consider for instance, the woman trader who has harvested maize and they have excess maize that they want to trade to the neighboring country, and the border, they stay at the border or they live near the border. And so they go to the market, which happens to be, just across the border from them. The aspirations that we have is that as Africa, we will be able to reduce the trading barriers that this person faces. And so at the very micro level, looking at cross-border trade, there's expectation for some sort of alleviation of the challenges that they face. And this can be just in terms of reducing the border procedures that they face, or granting them certain exemptions, or even, distinguishing between their products and other global products, so that you can give them a favorable trading regime that allows them to thrive and to grow as businesses. So certainly there's a lot of opportunity for SMEs that are based on the continent to trade across borders, whether through establishment of, information systems that allow them to know markets, how the markets are, to have standardized, actually harmonized standards, because one big challenge has often been that, how do you look at quality of the products that are produced? And so those are all things that should be defined and determined in the trade agreement. And negotiations are going on right now in order to agree on what those standards ought to be, defining rules of origin, which essentially is about how do we define that this particular product is made in, say, Uganda or made in Kenya. And so defining those rules and getting everyone to agree on them so that trading can therefore become live and enhanced.
Okay. So the agreement is setting the framework. Now, how can the SMEs prepare themselves so that they can benefit from this agreement?
Well, in a number of ways. Really it all boils down to the kind of challenges that SMEs face.
Okay.
On the one hand, you've got a challenge of market access. So before, you find that trading between countries, faced lots of challenges.
Okay.
So the market does not exist at that point. And so just by the establishment of this continental-wide free trade area, now you have a market.
Okay.
And so SMEs that are poised for cross-border trade have to therefore begin to plan for those opportunities when they occur.
Yeah.
An example can be this. Within the East Africa, for instance, because the East African community has got a customs union, so it's a higher level of trade liberalization. So if you think about it, you've got a given number, you've got a number of liberalizations. So this is basically the extent of opening up.
Okay.
So the most basic is a free trade area,
Okay.
which is what Africa is doing.
Okay.
So a free trade area just allows you to be able to buy and sell goods across the border. So as you go up a notch higher, you then go into a customs union.
Okay.
And a customs union is essentially allowing for not only the trade of goods and services, but also free movement of goods and customs territory.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you're importing something into the East African region, all the countries within the membership have got a common external tariff that they apply.
Okay.
And so people within that community have advantage because they don't face those charges.
Okay.
But the ones that are outside of the membership will face those charges. So there are more opportunities for them. The other aspect that is available is in terms of just free movement of persons. So this one is now called common market. So it's a second degree higher from a free trade area.
Okay.
So a common market is essentially a level of liberalization that allows for rights of establishment of not only goods, but also capital and people. So here you have to achieve a harmonization of even labor standards.
Yeah.
And so that, for instance, if you are a trained accountant and you have a chartered certification, your certification is valid across all the member states. And so those are some of the things that benefit SMEs, because that it therefore means that you have a pool of human resource that you can tap into, that the trading framework allows you to take advantage of. You also have markets that are now expanded and preferential treatment within those markets. Okay. So that's very important to distinguish.
When you talk about the agreement on paper, it sounds like something fantastic. But here we have nations who have their own interest, which at some point will supersede the agreement. Don't you think it's a challenge?
It is a challenge. It is a challenge. So if we go back to, because this is not the first agreement of its kind in Africa. So if you look at these regional economic communities that exist within Africa, those political will challenges often come into play, where you've agreed that, for instance, there's open trade and open rights of establishment, and yet you'll find a nation, because of internal pressures, domestic pressures, they will say, no, for us, we are not open to, say, Kenyans, or we are not open to Ugandans at this point in time, right? In spite of committing to those regional goals that you have in the agreement.
Okay.
So those are there, and the idea is to foster political will, which you cannot do in a legal framework.
Yeah.
It's essentially the leadership of these nations.
Of politicians.
Yes, and it relies on the goodwill.
Okay.
And so there has to be, the legal agreement has to be complemented by that political goodwill.
Okay.
And a commitment, a genuine commitment to live up to those goals.
Okay. Yeah. From a logistical point of view, what do you think will be the main challenges for us to see this agreement to see the light of the day?
So from a logistics point of view, logistics comes with so many systems, right? For instance, you have to have a tracking system in place that is able to track the cargo or the consignments across the borders. The border agencies and revenue authorities have to be able to share information with each other. And so you have to provide for that. There has to be a system for them to be able to do that. In cases where you have even more advanced integration goals being achieved, you have to also have sharing of revenue. It's not only information, it's also revenue. Because, for instance, in the case of the East African region, a good can come in at Mombasa port, destined for Uganda. And so the duty charged at that point can be collected by the Kenyan Revenue Authority.
Okay.
But really, it's duty that's legitimately supposed to be collected by the Uganda Revenue Authority.
Yeah.
And so in such instances, there has to be communication in place that, okay, this particular consignment was cleared in Kenya. This is the revenue that has been charged. And so that has to be onward transmitted to the Uganda Revenue Authority. That right now has a lot of challenges, and it is not yet in place.
Okay.
But those are the aspirations, and those are the real challenges that you then face from a logistical standpoint.
Okay.
The other one is just the issue of documentation. How do you process these documentations? Various border points have their requirements. They have, what they need you to clear. How do we harmonize this paperwork? How do you ensure that, the paperwork doesn't stand in the way of your consignment that is moving across the borders?
Do you think the abolition of revenue will spur economic growth in the continent?
So it's
abolition of taxes. Sorry. Yeah.
Of tariffs.
Yeah.
It's a balance. It's a balance, and it's a trade-off.
Okay.
The trade-off here is a lot of countries depend on tariff revenues, and tariff revenues make a big proportion of their revenue portfolios. And so there initially is a resistance to reduce tariffs, right? Okay. But in any trading arrangement, there are two effects that come into play. There are those we call, trade creating effects, and those we call trade diverting effects. The trade creating effects are the positive ones, where as a result of this expanded market, though you've sacrificed your revenue in terms of tariff revenue, you're able to maximize revenue based on other taxes.
Okay.
For instance, it can be you have now, as a result of the increased market access, there's increased FDI, so foreign investment is more, and therefore there's a tax revenue that is attached to that.
Okay.
Or even that because this business is now not paying that much in tariffs, they can, essentially plow back and expand their operations. And so in terms of GDP growth impacts, those often come about. Those are the multipliers. Okay. And so these trade creating effects often are able, and it's been demonstrated, are often able to overcome the tariff losses that are experienced.
Okay.
The one that is adverse is usually in trade diversion, where, you now have increased market access as a nation, but in your configuration, you have a partner nation which has a better business environment. And so the business that was here now decides to move to there. So you've now not only lost in terms of your tariff, but you've also lost, in terms of all the multipliers that come with a business being established in your nation.
So when you're talking about business environment, we have some countries are more developed than the others. So don't you think more developed countries will benefit more as compared to less developed African countries?
Well, not really. The economic history has told us that even when you have countries with very big economies going into configurations with small economic countries, there is still economic sense for them to enter those kind of trade integration efforts. And the logic behind them is that, as an exporting nation, as a liberalized nation, you often develop a specialization in certain areas. And so that specialization essentially allows you to partner even with a small size country if you're a big size country, and all of you to move your optimal growth forward. And so the fear that is often there that, when we go into a configuration with a big economy, that is then solved, because even within the global trading context, that small economy still has something to contribute.
So when you're talking about that, let me ask you this question. In terms of if someone wants to invest, we have a country that has a good infrastructure, good storage, and we have another one that it's the opposite of this. As an investor, where will you go to?
Certainly, you'll go to where the business environment is good, together with the infrastructure and all that. So that's a no-brainer. But the argument that I'm making is, all things notwithstanding, right? As long as you have a big economy versus a small economy, it is not a zero-sum game, right? It's not a zero-sum game that if we enter a configuration, for me to gain, the other person has to lose. It's not that way whatsoever. The issue is that all countries have an opportunity to grow, right, to their optimal level, even within those configurations, because those configurations do give them an added advantage because of that preferential market access that they now get, an added advantage that they would not get if they were outside of that configuration.
These African countries that you are talking about, they are still members in other trade agreements externally from countries outside Africa. How will that relationship affect the agreement?
So that's the thing that they have to be very careful about. And that's why they enter into negotiations. Because at the end of the day, you as, the trade policy makers have to look out for what's best for your country. And so when they're developing their country positions, it has to be informed, with all the information that they require, and it has to take insight from all the trading arrangements that they are part of. It would be counterintuitive for you to, for instance, go into negotiations unprepared, and therefore you lose out because it's negotiations. At the end of the day, it's an agreement, it's a contract. And so if you do not have the capacity to negotiate a good deal, then, you'll come off worse than your counterpart. And so, this is a very important point. It means that, as nations negotiate, they have to have the capacity. And that's a big constraint in Africa. And so one of the things that the African Union has been trying to do is provide for support for these negotiations, so that people can negotiate from a good starting point. But also at the same time, we have lots of advantages, because already we have regional economic communities who have already negotiated and closed on.
But when you talk about the regional economic blocks that we have, someone will argue they've failed.
In what sense?
Because we have seen they have set rules, and at the end of the day, they do not. At the end of the day, they do not actualize.
No, they do actualize. They do actualize. Perhaps there's a lot of frustration because they are not being implemented as fast as they need to, but they certainly do actualize. I think the more important question is, to what extent can the population, the citizens who ought to benefit from these trading arrangements, to what extent, first of all, are they involved in the prioritization of those negotiations, so that it's not just a leadership thing, right? That, this is a president's idea. So the population has to feel that, they're engaged, and the negotiations take their own priorities and include and integrate their own priorities, but also that they stand to benefit, legitimate, tangible benefits, because that's often lost. So if you take, for instance, that, yes, practically by law, right now with the EAC case, any Kenyan at the border ought to be able to trade freely with the neighboring country. So if that is not happening, or if they have to circumvent and, use maybe, corrupt means to access those markets, then it therefore means that, our law, our integration law, doesn't matter or does not apply,
Okay.
or is not implemented.
Okay.
So if that is indeed the case, then the onus really is on the implementation agencies.
Okay.
And so I think rather than giving a blanket rebuke of the integration efforts, the issue should be, where are we facing these challenges? Where are agencies failing? And more so to do with the implementation side, so
Okay.
that people can be able to get the tangible benefits that they're after.
Okay, thank you. So let's take a short commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how beneficial this agreement is to common mwananchi. We are talking about those ladies selling vegetables. Is it beneficial to them, or it will only benefit, the upper class?